How many times have you promised yourself you would finally become a better version of you? And somehow, at the end of the day, you still felt like you weren't enough? Maybe you know that feeling. You wake up early, make your tea or coffee, sit by the window while the world is still quiet, and you whisper to yourself, "Today, I will do better. Today, I will fix myself." You read another book about healing. You try another meditation. You listen to another talk, another method, another teacher who tells you there is something to improve, something to cleanse, something to overcome. And for a moment, it feels hopeful. But later, when the house is silent again, there is that old, familiar weight in the chest. A soft voice that says, "Still not there, still not whole, still not enough." If you're honest, it's exhausting. Not the life outside, but the constant project of trying to repair yourself. It's like you've turned your own soul into a broken machine on a workbench, always tightening screws, replacing parts, diagnosing flaws. And today, I want to gently offer you a different possibility. What if nothing was ever broken? What if the very effort to fix yourself is the only thing making you feel incomplete? For many years, I lived exactly like that. I treated my inner life like a problem to solve. If I felt sadness, I tried to eliminate it. If I felt fear, I tried to conquer it. If I felt doubt, I searched for techniques to reprogram it. I thought spirituality meant constant self-improvement. Be calmer, be more positive, be more awakened, be more advanced. But do you see the hidden message underneath all of that? It quietly says, who you are right now is not acceptable. And the body hears that. The heart hears that. Your nervous system hears that. Even if you speak beautiful affirmations, deep down, you are still at war with yourself. It's like standing in front of a mirror and wiping it again and again with anxious hands. You think you're cleaning it, but the cloth is wet with fear. So the more you wipe, the foggier it becomes. The reflection doesn't get clearer. It disappears. That's what happens when we try to fix ourselves with tension. We don't heal, we blur. Somewhere along the way, modern spirituality became another form of pressure, another silent voice saying, hurry up, heal faster, evolve quicker, manifest better. Even meditation became a task. Even prayer became effort. Even self-love became something to achieve. And the irony is heartbreaking, because awakening was never meant to feel like climbing a mountain with stones in your backpack. It was meant to feel like putting the backpack down. If you look at nature, nothing tries to fix itself. The sky doesn't try to improve its blueness. The ocean doesn't attend workshops on how to be deeper. A tree doesn't wake up thinking, I must become a better tree today. It simply stands, rooted, allowing the sun, allowing the rain, allowing the seasons. And because it allows, it grows. But we humans learned something different. We learned to resist. We learned to judge every emotion. We learned to label parts of ourselves as bad, wrong, or unworthy. And from a certain perspective, even physics whispers the same truth to us. At the most fundamental level, everything is energy. Not solid, not fixed, not flawed, just vibration. Thoughts are vibrations. Emotions are vibrations. Your sense of self is a pattern of energy moving through awareness. So when you constantly think, I need to fix myself, you are tuning your entire system to the frequency of something is wrong. And like a radio, you only receive stations that match that signal. More problems, more self-criticism, more evidence that you're not enough. Not because life is punishing you, but because energy responds to resonance. You don't attract what you want. You resonate with what you believe you are. So if you believe you are broken, life will gently mirror that belief. Not to hurt you, but to show you what you're holding inside. And this is where awakening truly begins. Not when you finally perfect yourself. Not when you eliminate every fear. Not when you become some glowing, enlightened being. Awakening begins in a much quieter moment. A very ordinary moment. The moment you get tired. Tired of fighting yourself. Tired of chasing a future version of you. Tired of treating your own heart like a problem. And you sit down. Maybe on the edge of your bed. Maybe in your car. Maybe watching the sunset. And you exhale. Not a dramatic exhale. Just a soft one. And something inside whispers, what if I stop trying, not giving up on life? But giving up on the war, that's the difference. Because there is a kind of surrender that is not defeat, it's relief. Like unclenching a fist you didn't realize you were holding for decades. Like floating on water instead of trying to swim upstream. Like a river that stops struggling and suddenly remembers it already knows how to flow. That's what we're doing here together. Not starting another self-improvement project, not adding more techniques, not turning your soul into homework. Today, we are simply pausing, breathing, and considering a radical idea that might feel almost too simple. Maybe you don't need to be repaired. Maybe you don't need to be upgraded. Maybe you were never broken in the first place. Maybe all that's required is to come home to yourself, to gently set down this heavy toolbox of fixing, to stop polishing the mirror with fear, to let the dust settle on its own. And when it settles, you might discover something very quiet, very steady, very alive underneath all the noise. A presence that has never been damaged, never rushed, never lacking. The part of you that was here before every mistake and will still be here long after every story fades. That presence doesn't need improvement. It only needs your permission to be felt. So in this video, we're not going to push. We're not going to force. We're not going to try to become someone new. We're going to do something far gentler. We're going to remember who you were before the world told you that you weren't enough. And maybe, just maybe, that remembering is the real beginning of your spiritual awakening. 1. The illusion that something is wrong with me. There is a quiet sentence that most people never say out loud, yet it hums underneath almost every decision they make, almost every prayer they whisper at night, almost every goal they chase across an entire lifetime. And that sentence is painfully simple, almost childlike in its innocence, yet heavy enough to bend the spine of the soul. And it sounds like this: there must be something wrong with me. You don't learn this sentence from a single traumatic moment. You absorb it slowly, like moisture in the air, like a scent that clings to your clothes without you noticing. Because from the time you are very young, the world gently, persistently, tirelessly suggests that who you are right now is only a draft, only a rough version, only something waiting to be corrected and improved and polished until it becomes acceptable. You are told to be better, to look better, to earn more, to achieve more, to be more confident, more disciplined, more productive, more spiritual. And even when these messages sound positive on the surface, even when they are wrapped in motivational language and smiling faces, there is always a hidden undertone that quietly says you are not enough as you are, that you must upgrade yourself before you deserve love, peace, or belonging. So you grow up carrying an invisible measuring tape, constantly comparing yourself to other people, to younger versions of yourself, to imaginary future versions of yourself. And you keep asking, sometimes with hope and sometimes with shame, why you cannot seem to finally arrive at that place where you feel complete, where you feel at home inside your own skin, where you stop feeling like a project under construction. And after many years of walking this road, I began to see something very clearly. Something that hurt at first because it challenged everything I had been taught. And that is the simple truth that our society does not know how to leave a human being alone in their natural wholeness, because it has built an entire economy around convincing you that you are missing something and then selling you the solution. It sells you beauty because you are not attractive enough. It sells you success because you are not accomplished enough. It sells you self-help because you are not healed enough. And even in spiritual spaces, it sells you enlightenment as if it were a product on a shelf, something to obtain after enough effort, as if your true nature were a destination instead of the ground you are already standing on. When you live in that atmosphere for decades, the mind begins to internalize the message so deeply that it becomes your own voice. And one day you wake up and realize the harshest critic in your life is no longer society or your parents or your teachers. It is the narrator inside your head who keeps whispering that you should be further along by now, that you should have fixed yourself already, that you should not still feel this fear, this sadness, this confusion. And this is where the ego quietly builds its home, because the ego does not survive on love or presence or simple being. The ego survives on lack, on comparison, on the constant feeling that something essential is missing and must be chased. The ego feeds on the idea of deficiency the way a fire feeds on dry wood. And every time you say to yourself that you are broken or behind or not good enough, you are unknowingly throwing another log into that fire. And of course it keeps burning. And of course you feel exhausted, because you are the one supplying the fuel. For many years I did not understand this. And maybe you didn't either. Because we tend to think the ego is something dramatic, or arrogant, or selfish. But often it is much quieter and much more subtle. It simply shows up as self-doubt, as constant self-improvement, as the endless attempt to redesign your personality. And it disguises itself as responsibility, while it quietly erodes your peace. You tell yourself you are just trying to grow, just trying to be better, just trying to fix your flaws. Yet underneath all of that effort, there is a small, trembling assumption that who you are right now is unacceptable. And that assumption shapes everything. Because here is something gentle but powerful that most people overlook. And it is something both ancient wisdom and modern science are beginning to agree on. And that is the understanding that you are not only a body or a story or a collection of memories, you are also a field of energy, a living vibration, a subtle current moving through space. Every thought you think has a tone. Every emotion you feel has a frequency. Every belief you hold is like a tuning fork quietly vibrating inside your chest. And your life, in many mysterious ways, begins to organize itself around those vibrations. So when you wake up each morning carrying the belief that something is wrong with you, that you are fundamentally flawed and must be repaired, you are not just thinking an innocent thought, you are broadcasting a signal into your entire system, into your body, into your relationships, into the way you interpret every event that happens to you. It is like setting a radio to a certain station and then being surprised that you keep hearing the same kind of music all day long. If the station is tuned to lack, you will hear lack everywhere. If the station is tuned to unworthiness, you will find proof of unworthiness everywhere. Not because life is cruel, not because the universe is judging you, but because perception follows vibration, and vibration follows belief. When you believe you are broken, you begin to notice everything that confirms that story. Every mistake becomes evidence. Every rejection becomes confirmation. Every small failure becomes another brick in the wall of, I am not enough. And slowly, without realizing it, you construct a prison out of your own interpretations. And I say this to you not as a teacher standing above you, but as someone who has lived inside that prison for many years. Someone who has spent nights staring at the ceiling, wondering why nothing ever felt sufficient, why every achievement tasted bland after a few days, why even spiritual practices felt like another test I was failing. It took me a long time to understand that the pain was not coming from my imperfections. It was coming from my resistance to them, from the constant argument with reality, from the refusal to allow myself to simply be human. Because the moment you label parts of yourself as wrong, you split yourself in two. You create an inner war between the version you think you should be and the version you actually are. And no one can feel peaceful while fighting themselves all day long. And maybe the most compassionate realization of all is this, that the belief, I am not enough, is not a personal failure. It is a learned habit, something you inherited from a culture that forgot how to honor simple being, something you absorbed without consent, something that can gently be unlearned. When you begin to see that, something softens, because you stop blaming yourself for feeling broken and start questioning the story itself, and you begin to ask, very quietly, very honestly, what if nothing is wrong with me? What if the pain I feel is not proof of defect, but proof that I have been judging myself too harshly for too long? And that question, asked sincerely and tenderly, is often the first crack in the illusion, the first ray of light entering a room that has been dark for decades. The first step not toward becoming someone better, but toward finally accepting the one you have always been. 2. The trap of constantly trying to fix yourself. There comes a point in life, often after many quiet disappointments, that no one else can see, when you begin to notice that your days are no longer guided by curiosity or joy, but by a subtle, relentless urge to correct yourself, as if you were a machine slightly out of order that requires endless adjustments. And even though everything you do looks noble from the outside, from the inside it feels like you are always chasing something just beyond reach, like walking toward the horizon and wondering why it never comes closer. You move from one book to another, from one teacher to another, from one course to another, telling yourself that the next method will finally unlock the door, that the next practice will finally heal the wound, that the next insight will finally silence the restless voice inside your head. And at first it feels inspiring because each new beginning carries hope, but after many years, the hope begins to feel suspiciously similar to exhaustion, like drinking salt water to quench your thirst. I remember seasons of my own life when my shelves were filled with spiritual books. My phone was full of saved talks and guided meditations. My weekends were dedicated to workshops and retreats. And yet beneath all that effort, there was a quiet anxiety that never truly left, a sense that I was running late to my own awakening, as if enlightenment were a train I might miss if I did not hurry fast enough. And what I did not understand back then, what no one gently told me, was that this constant searching can easily become another form of escape, because when you keep running toward the next solution, you never actually sit still long enough to meet yourself as you are, and without realizing it, you turn your own inner life into a project that must be managed rather than a presence that can be felt. So you jump from one method to another the way a traveler jumps between trains without ever stepping outside the station to feel the sun on their face, always preparing for the next departure, always thinking the real destination is somewhere else, never noticing that life has been quietly waiting for you right here all along. Even meditation, which was once meant to be a doorway into rest, becomes another performance, another test you secretly believe you must pass. And instead of sitting down like someone settling into a warm bath, you sit down like a soldier preparing for battle, watching your thoughts with suspicion, trying to force your mind into silence, judging yourself every time a memory or worry appears. You call it meditation, but your shoulders are tight, your jaw is clenched, your breath is shallow. And somewhere inside there is still that same old voice saying you are doing it wrong, that you should be calmer by now, more spiritual by now, more evolved by now. So even in stillness, you are not still. Even in silence, you are not at peace. Because the energy underneath the practice is not relaxation, it is tension. And tension, no matter how beautifully disguised, is still tension. It took me many years to realize that you cannot bully yourself into awakening. You cannot pressure yourself into peace. You cannot command your heart to open through discipline alone, because the heart is not a door you kick down. It is a flower that opens when it feels safe. The more you try to change yourself with force, the more you quietly confirm the belief that something is wrong with you. And this is the paradox that traps so many sincere seekers, because the very effort that is supposed to heal you is actually reinforcing the wound. Every time you say, "I must fix this part of me," you are subtly declaring that this part is unacceptable, and the body hears that rejection, and the nervous system tightens, and your entire being moves into defense, like an animal that senses danger. And from that defensive state, nothing truly blossoms, because the energy of fixing is almost always the energy of resistance. It is a quiet argument with reality. It is you standing in front of the present moment saying, "This should not be happening. I should not feel this way. I should already be different." But reality does not respond kindly to being argued with. Life is like water, and when you try to push against water, you only create waves and turbulence. When you try to force water into a certain shape, it slips through your fingers. The same is true with your inner world. When you resist sadness, it lingers longer. When you resist fear, it grows louder. When you resist yourself, you feel split in two. Resistance creates friction, and friction creates heat, and heat eventually becomes suffering. You can feel it in your body if you pay attention. That subtle grinding sensation in the chest, that tightness in the stomach, that tiredness behind the eyes that comes not from work but from constant self-surveillance, from always watching yourself and correcting yourself and measuring yourself against an invisible standard that keeps moving further away. It is like driving with the handbrake half pulled up, wondering why the car struggles and the engine overheats, never realizing that the problem is not the road, but the quiet resistance you are carrying. And what makes this trap so heartbreaking is that most people caught in it are not lazy or careless. They are deeply sincere, deeply sensitive, deeply longing for truth, which is exactly why they try so hard, which is exactly why they blame themselves when things do not change fast enough. They think the answer is more effort, more discipline, more techniques, more control. But sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is not to try harder, but to soften. Not to add another practice, but to put all practices down for a moment. Not to chase another version of yourself, but to sit beside the one who is already here like an old friend. Because healing does not come from fighting yourself into submission. Healing comes from ending the fight. When you stop treating yourself like a problem to solve and start treating yourself like someone you love, something miraculous begins to happen very quietly, very naturally, without fireworks or dramatic breakthroughs. Your breath deepens, your shoulders drop, your thoughts slow down, and for the first time in a long time, you feel less like a project and more like a person, like a human being allowed to be imperfect, allowed to be unfinished, allowed to simply exist without constantly earning the right to exist. And in that gentle allowing, something inside you begins to reorganize on its own. The way a cut heals when you stop picking at it. The way muddy water clears when you stop stirring it. The way a tired child falls asleep when you finally stop shaking them awake. You start to realize that perhaps the path was never about fixing yourself at all, but about learning how to stop interfering with your own natural wholeness. About trusting that life knows how to breathe you, how to guide you, how to unfold you without all this strain. And that realization, simple and humble and deeply human, feels less like climbing a mountain and more like coming home after a very long walk, setting your bags down by the door and finally allowing yourself to rest. 3. Awakening is not becoming someone new. There is a very tender misunderstanding that many of us carry for most of our lives, and it hides behind beautiful words like growth and transformation and evolution. Yet beneath all those inspiring phrases, there is still a quiet assumption that who we are right now is only a temporary draft, only a half-finished sketch that must someday be replaced by a brighter, wiser, more spiritual version of ourselves. And because of that assumption, we keep walking through life as if we are always on the way to somewhere else, never realizing that what we are searching for has been breathing quietly inside us since the very beginning. For a long time, I believed that awakening meant upgrading myself, as if enlightenment were a higher floor in a tall building and I simply had to climb enough stairs to reach it. And every book I read felt like another step, every workshop another step, every realization another step. Yet no matter how many steps I climbed, there was still the same old sense of incompleteness, following me like a shadow, because deep down I was still operating from the belief that my current self was not worthy of peace. And this belief is very subtle, because it dresses itself in noble clothing. It calls itself self-improvement. It calls itself spiritual discipline. It calls itself personal development. But if you look closely, you will see that it still whispers the same ancient fear. The fear that you are not enough yet, that you must accumulate more knowledge, more insights, more practices before you deserve to rest. So we become collectors of wisdom, the way some people become collectors of possessions, filling our minds with quotes and concepts and techniques, hoping that if we gather enough understanding, we will finally feel whole. But instead, we often feel heavier, like travelers carrying too many suitcases through an airport, exhausted, not because the journey is long, but because we refuse to put anything down. What I discovered, slowly and almost reluctantly, is that awakening does not feel like adding something new to yourself. It feels like removing something false. It feels less like construction and more like subtraction, less like climbing upward and more like gently peeling away layers that were never truly you. It is like wearing too many coats in the summer and finally taking them off one by one until you can breathe again, realizing that the lightness you were searching for was not something you needed to earn. It was simply your natural state underneath all the extra fabric. Because the truth is both simpler and more humbling than we expect, which is that you do not awaken by becoming extraordinary. You awaken by becoming ordinary again, by returning to the quiet simplicity of being alive without constantly narrating and judging and correcting yourself. The mind loves complexity. It loves systems and hierarchies and levels. It wants to believe there is always a higher stage to reach, but the heart understands something else entirely, something much softer, something that feels more like coming home than achieving a goal. And this is where many people become confused, because they imagine awakening as some dramatic transformation, some dazzling state where fear disappears forever and the sun always shines inside your chest. Yet in reality, awakening often feels very gentle, almost disappointingly normal. Like sitting on your porch at sunset and suddenly realizing that nothing is missing. It is not fireworks. It is not angels singing. It is not becoming a different person. It is the quiet recognition that the person you have always been was never as flawed as you thought. If I could offer you an image, it would be this one. The sun on a cloudy day. Because the sun does not need to be repaired or brightened or improved. It is already shining with the same steady light it has always had. But when clouds pass in front of it, the world below assumes the light has disappeared. When in truth, nothing has happened to the sun at all. The only thing that changed was the sky. And in the same way, your true nature has never been damaged, never been diminished, never been stained by your mistakes or your regrets, or your years of confusion, yet thoughts and beliefs move through you like clouds. And when those clouds gather, you forget your own brightness and start searching for ways to manufacture light. So you try to light candles. You try to build fires. You try to invent complicated spiritual technologies. All the while, the sun is already there, quietly shining behind everything. Awakening is not lighting the sun. It is simply allowing the clouds to pass. And clouds do not pass because you fight them. They pass because you stop clinging to them. This is why awakening has less to do with learning and more to do with unlearning, less to do with accumulating and more to do with letting go. You begin to question the stories you inherited, the labels you accepted, the masks you wore to survive, and one by one, you set them down like old costumes after a long play, realizing that you were never those characters in the first place. You were never the failure. You were never the disappointment. You were never the broken one. Those were roles you tried on because life asked you to, because family or culture or circumstance shaped you in certain ways. But beneath every role, there has always been the same quiet awareness, the same simple presence looking out through your eyes. When you start to sense that presence, something inside you relaxes in a way that no achievement ever produced, because you finally stop trying to become someone else and start allowing yourself to be exactly who you already are. And strangely enough, this is when real change begins to happen naturally, not forced or dramatic or exhausting, but organic, like a flower opening when the weather warms, because when you are no longer at war with yourself, your energy is no longer tied up in resistance. You do not have to push growth. Growth happens on its own. You do not have to force healing. Healing unfolds in its own rhythm. Just as the body knows how to mend a wound without your constant interference, your consciousness knows how to return to balance when you stop trying to control every movement. So awakening is not a process of becoming someone new, not a journey toward a better self waiting in the future, not a ladder you must climb rung by rung with trembling hands. It is a remembering of the childlike simplicity you once had before the world told you who to be, a remembering of the quiet aliveness you feel when you sit by the ocean or watch the trees sway in the wind. A remembering that you are not the noise in your head, but the space in which that noise appears. And when you truly understand this, not just intellectually, but in your bones, you begin to walk through life differently, softer, slower, kinder to yourself, because you are no longer trying to manufacture worthiness. You are simply living from a worthiness that was always there. And that gentle shift, that almost invisible turning of the heart back toward itself, is what I have come to recognize as awakening, not the birth of a new person, but the quiet homecoming of the one who was here all along. 4. The perspective of the energy field and the quiet language of quantum science. There was a time in my life when words like energy and vibration sounded distant and abstract to me, like concepts meant only for laboratories or philosophy books, and I would nod politely when people spoke about them without truly feeling their relevance to the simple, ordinary struggles of daily life. Yet after walking through enough inner storms and sitting with enough silent mornings, I began to sense that these words were not mystical decorations or complicated theories, but very gentle descriptions of something we experience every single day without naming it. If you sit quietly for a moment and really observe your own life, you start to notice that nothing inside you is fixed or solid in the way you once imagined, because your moods change like the weather. Your thoughts drift like clouds, your body renews itself breath by breath, and even the person you think you are feels slightly different from one season to the next, as if everything about you is moving, flowing, vibrating in subtle ways that never truly stop. Modern science, in its own careful language, tells us something similar, that what we call matter is not as solid as it appears, that at the most fundamental level, everything is made of tiny movements, tiny pulses, tiny dancing particles that behave more like waves of energy than like hard objects. And when I first began to understand this, not just with my intellect, but with my intuition, something inside me softened, because it meant that life was not a rigid machine but a living field, something fluid and responsive and alive. And if everything is energy in motion, then you are not an exception to that truth, because your body is energy, your breath is energy, your heartbeat is energy, and even the invisible landscape of your mind, the thoughts you think and the emotions you carry, are also forms of energy moving through the same field. A thought is not just a sentence in your head. It has a texture and a tone and a weight. You can feel it immediately in your chest or your stomach or your shoulders. And an emotion is not just a psychological label, it is a current running through your entire system, sometimes warm and open like sunlight on your skin, sometimes heavy and tight like a cold wind pressing against your back. When you begin to pay attention in this way, you realize that every inner state has its own frequency, its own quiet music, and your life begins to respond to that music the way a dance floor responds to a rhythm, organizing itself around whatever song is playing most consistently. So when you carry the thought, "I am broken," day after day, even if you never say it out loud, that thought becomes a low, heavy vibration that hums beneath everything else, and like a tuning fork struck again and again, it sends the same signal through your body, through your decisions, through the way you interpret every event that happens to you. You start to walk differently, you speak differently, you expect disappointment without realizing it. You read neutral situations as personal failures, not because you are cursed or unlucky, but because your perception is quietly locked onto a certain frequency, and everything you experience gets filtered through that lens. It is like wearing glasses with a faint gray tint and then believing the world itself has lost its color. And this is not punishment, and it is not fate. It is simply resonance. Life tends to meet you where you are vibrating. If you feel unworthy, you unconsciously choose situations that confirm that feeling. If you feel unsafe, you interpret life as threatening. If you feel incomplete, you chase endlessly without satisfaction. The outer world becomes a mirror of the inner field. When I first saw this clearly, I did not feel blamed. I felt relieved, because for the first time I understood that nothing was wrong with me. I was simply tuned to a frequency I had learned in childhood, and like any frequency, it could gently change, not through force, but through awareness. And here is where something very tender happens, because the moment you stop attacking yourself and begin to accept yourself, even just a little, the entire field shifts in a way that is almost impossible to describe but very easy to feel. Acceptance has a different texture. It is softer, warmer, more spacious. When you say, "This is how I feel right now, and that is okay," your shoulders loosen, your breath deepens, and something inside you stops bracing for impact. It is as if your whole being had been clenching for years and finally allows itself to rest. From an energetic perspective, this is not just emotional comfort. It is coherence. Your mind and body begin to move in the same direction instead of pulling against each other. Your heart rate slows. Your nervous system settles. Your thoughts become less chaotic. The field around you becomes clearer, like muddy water left undisturbed. And in that clarity, new possibilities quietly appear. Not because you force them into existence, but because you are no longer blocking them with resistance. Resistance, I have learned, is like trying to swim upstream while carrying stones in your pockets. Exhausting and unnecessary, because the river of life already knows where to take you if you simply stop fighting the current. When you resist your fear, you tighten. When you resist your sadness, you contract. When you resist your imperfections, you split yourself into pieces. But when you allow them, when you say, "Yes, this too belongs," something opens. The energy that was stuck begins to move. The knots begin to loosen. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, you start to feel more like yourself. Not a new self, not an improved self, just a more harmonious version of the same being you have always been. It is like an orchestra tuning before a performance. each instrument adjusting gently until the sounds blend together. And suddenly, the music flows without effort. You do not have to command the harmony. You simply create the conditions for it. And relaxation, true relaxation, is one of those conditions. Not laziness, not giving up, but a deep inner permission to stop controlling every outcome, to stop micromanaging every thought, to trust that life is intelligent enough to guide you without constant interference. When you relax into yourself, when you soften your grip on who you think you should be, you begin to synchronize with a quieter rhythm, something steadier and kinder, something that feels less like striving and more like flowing. And from that place, choices become clearer, relationships feel lighter, and even challenges seem less personal, because you are no longer reacting from a contracted field of fear, but responding from a wider field of presence. So this perspective of energy and vibration is not meant to sound mystical or complicated. It is simply a gentle reminder that your inner state matters deeply, that the way you treat yourself is not just psychological but energetic, that every moment of self-acceptance is like opening a window and letting fresh air move through a room that has been closed for too long. And perhaps the most beautiful part of all is this, that you do not have to learn how to shine or struggle to become aligned, because harmony is your natural state, just like the sun shining behind the clouds, just like the ocean returning to calm after a storm. All you truly have to do is stop tightening, stop resisting, stop trying to fix what was never broken, and allow yourself to rest back into the simple, steady field of being that has been carrying you all along. 5. The sacred exhaustion that quietly signals you are about to awaken. There is a particular kind of tiredness that does not come from the body and cannot be cured by sleep. A tiredness that settles much deeper than muscles and bones, a heaviness that seems to live somewhere behind the heart and behind the eyes. And if you have ever felt it, you will recognize it immediately, because it feels less like simple fatigue and more like your entire soul whispering that it can no longer continue the way it has been living. This exhaustion often arrives after many years of trying very hard to be a better person, after decades of striving and fixing and improving and performing, after countless mornings when you promised yourself you would push a little further, and evenings when you quietly judged yourself for not having gone far enough. And one day, without warning, something inside simply says, "I cannot keep doing this anymore." Not with anger or drama, but with a soft, honest resignation that feels strangely truthful. At first, this feeling can be frightening because we are taught to admire motivation and productivity and constant growth. So when the desire to try harder begins to fade, we assume something is wrong. We assume we are becoming lazy or depressed or lost, and we rush to diagnose ourselves, to fix this new problem, not realizing that this tiredness might be the most intelligent signal our inner life has ever sent us. I remember when this sacred exhaustion first visited me, and I did not recognize it as sacred at all, because all I could feel was confusion, as if the map I had been following for years had suddenly dissolved in my hands, and the goals that once excited me no longer had any flavor, and the self-improvement routines that once gave me a sense of control now felt strangely hollow, like repeating lines from a play that no longer made sense. Books that once inspired me began to feel heavy. Techniques that once felt powerful began to feel mechanical. Even my dreams of becoming a better version of myself started to lose their shine, like old photographs fading in the sun. And I wondered what had happened to me, because from the outside my life looked stable enough, yet on the inside, it felt as if something fundamental had quietly collapsed. If you are walking through a similar season right now, I want you to slow down and breathe for a moment, because what you might be experiencing is not failure, not regression, not a breakdown, but the gentle beginning of a breakthrough that does not look dramatic or glamorous, but instead looks like emptiness. There comes a time when the soul grows tired of chasing perfection. There comes a time when you simply cannot pretend anymore that the next achievement will save you. There comes a time when you look at the endless ladder of becoming better and realize you no longer wish to climb. And this moment, although it feels like losing direction, is often the first honest moment of your life, because for the first time, you are no longer fueled by fear. For the first time, you are no longer running from the belief that you are not enough. For the first time, You are too tired to lie to yourself. And that honesty is sacred. The ego, which has been driving your life for so long with promises of improvement and success and recognition, begins to lose its energy. Not because you defeated it, not because you conquered it through discipline, but because you simply cannot keep feeding it the same old stories. The ego survives on effort and comparison and striving, and when you no longer have the strength to play that game, it slowly starts to dissolve like mist in the morning sun. But from the inside, this dissolution does not feel poetic or beautiful at first. It feels empty. It feels like standing in a wide, open field after the house you lived in for years has quietly disappeared. There is no furniture, no walls, no familiar structure, just space. And many people mistake this space for meaninglessness. They say, "I feel lost," or "I feel numb," or "I do not know who I am anymore." And they rush to rebuild another house, another identity, another set of goals, just to escape the discomfort of not knowing. Yet if you can stay here a little longer, if you can sit gently inside this openness without trying to fill it too quickly, you might discover something extraordinary hiding within the emptiness. Because when the old identity falls away, when the endless striving finally collapses under its own weight, what remains is not nothingness, but possibility. It is like a field after harvest, quiet and bare, not dead, but resting, preparing for something new that cannot grow, while the old crops still occupy the soil. This is why I call it sacred exhaustion, because it is the body and the soul refusing to continue a life that was never aligned with truth. It is life itself saying, "Enough pretending, enough performing, enough chasing. Now come back to what is real." And although it feels like you are falling apart, you are actually being taken apart very gently, layer by layer, like an old costume being removed after a long play, so that you can finally breathe as yourself. There is a beautiful image that has comforted me many times, the image of a caterpillar before it becomes a butterfly, because from the outside we only admire the wings. We only celebrate the flying, but we rarely talk about the strange, quiet stage in between, when the caterpillar dissolves inside the cocoon. Inside that cocoon, the old form literally breaks down into something unrecognizable. And if you could look at it in that moment, you might think something has gone terribly wrong. You might think the creature is dying, because nothing looks organized or complete. Yet that breakdown is not destruction. It is transformation. The old structure must soften and fall apart so that a new form can emerge. And perhaps you, in your exhaustion, are not failing at life. Perhaps you are simply inside your cocoon. Perhaps the reason you no longer feel excited about chasing perfection is because something wiser inside you knows that perfection was never the point. Perhaps the reason you feel empty is because the old stories no longer fit. Perhaps the reason you feel directionless is because you are being invited to stop following maps that were never truly yours. When I finally allowed myself to stop fighting this tiredness, when I stopped trying to force motivation and simply admitted, "I am tired of trying to fix myself," something very gentle happened. Something so quiet I almost missed it. My breath slowed, my thoughts softened, and underneath the exhaustion, there was a small, steady sense of relief, like setting down a heavy bag after carrying it for years, without realizing how much it weighed. In that relief, I sensed a truth that words can barely hold, which is that maybe life was never asking me to become someone extraordinary. Maybe it was simply inviting me to be here, fully, honestly, without all the armor. So if you are tired, deeply tired, not just physically but spiritually tired, please do not judge yourself too quickly. Do not rush to label it as weakness or failure, because this tiredness might be the most compassionate thing your soul has ever offered you. A quiet doorway out of struggle and into surrender, out of striving and into being, out of becoming and into remembering who you have always been. 6. The art of letting go instead of trying to fix. There is a quiet turning point that arrives after the long season of exhaustion, after you have tried every method you could find and pushed yourself in every direction you thought would save you, and suddenly you realize that you do not have the strength to keep fighting yourself anymore. And strangely enough, that realization does not feel like defeat, but like the first honest breath you have taken in years, as if something inside you has finally admitted that the battle was never necessary in the first place. For most of our lives, we are taught that progress means effort, and that effort means force. So we learn to tighten our muscles, clench our teeth, and push against whatever we do not like within ourselves, believing that if we resist hard enough, we will eventually shape ourselves into someone acceptable. Yet this strategy might work for lifting heavy objects or building houses, but it quietly fails when applied to the human heart. Because the heart does not open under pressure, it closes. So when you hear the phrase, "let go," it can sound suspicious at first, almost irresponsible, almost like giving up, because the mind has been trained to believe that if you stop trying, you will fall behind or become stagnant or lose control of your life. And I understand this fear deeply because I once carried it too. Because for many years I confused surrender with weakness and relaxation with laziness, and I thought that if I ever stopped fixing myself, everything would collapse. But life has a gentle way of teaching us through experience what concepts alone cannot explain. And what I discovered slowly, through many quiet evenings and many honest tears, is that letting go is not the same as quitting, and surrender is not the same as abandoning yourself. Because true letting go is not turning away from life but turning toward it without armor. Letting go is not saying, "I do not care anymore." Letting go is saying, "I am done hurting myself. I don't." It is not withdrawing from responsibility but releasing the constant inner violence you have been directing at your own soul. It is the difference between dropping a heavy stone because you are too weak to carry it and placing the stone down because you finally realize you never needed to carry it at all. When you stop trying to fix yourself, you are not neglecting yourself. You are ending a war. And many of us do not even realize how long this war has been going on, because it started so early that it feels normal. This quiet habit of judging every thought, correcting every emotion, criticizing every mistake, as if there were a strict supervisor living inside your head watching your every move. You wake up and immediately evaluate yourself. You feel sad and immediately ask how to remove it. You feel afraid and immediately search for techniques to conquer it. You feel uncertain and immediately look for answers to eliminate the discomfort. It is constant interference, like trying to rearrange the ocean, wave by wave. And after years of this, the soul becomes tired not because emotions are heavy, but because the resistance to them is heavy. This is where the art of letting go begins. Not as a dramatic spiritual act, but as a simple human kindness. A decision to stop treating yourself like an enemy that must be controlled, and start treating yourself like a friend who deserves patience. Instead of asking, "How do I fix this feeling?" you begin to ask, "Can I allow this feeling to be here for a moment without attacking it?" Well, present. Instead of tightening your chest when sadness appears, you soften your breath and make space for it, the way you would make space on the couch for an old friend who has come to visit. Instead of labeling fear as weakness, you listen to it gently, as if it were a small child trying to tell you something important. This shift sounds small, almost too simple to matter, yet it changes everything, because the moment you stop judging your inner world, the inner world stops fighting you back. I remember the first time I truly practiced this kind of allowing, and it was not in a temple or on a mountaintop, but in the most ordinary place, sitting alone in my room with a heaviness in my chest that I had been trying to get rid of for weeks. And for once, I did not reach for a book or a technique or a distraction. I simply sat there and breathed, slowly, deeply, as if I were sitting beside someone I loved who was in pain. I did not analyze. I did not correct. I did not try to improve. I just observed. I watched the sensations rise and fall like waves. And for the first time, I realized that emotions have their own intelligence, their own rhythm. And when you stop interfering, they move through you naturally. The way weather moves across the sky, sadness would swell and then soften. Fear would tighten and then loosen. Nothing stayed as long as I had feared. And I began to understand something very profound, which is that suffering is often not caused by the emotion itself, but by our resistance to it. An emotion is just energy in motion, but resistance is like building a dam in a river. The water cannot flow, so it stagnates and becomes heavy. When you let go of the dam, the river moves again. When you stop resisting, the energy balances itself. This is not magic. It is not mystical. It is simply the natural behavior of life. The body already knows how to regulate itself. The heart already knows how to heal. Consciousness already knows how to return to harmony. But our constant interference, our constant fixing and controlling and judging, interrupts that natural intelligence. So sometimes the most loving thing you can do is nothing at all. Nothing except breathing and witnessing and trusting. You take a slow breath and feel the air entering your lungs like a gentle tide. You watch your thoughts the way you would watch birds crossing the sky, without trying to catch them. You let sensations rise and fall without labeling them as good or bad. And little by little, something inside you begins to unclench. It feels like loosening a tight knot that has been tied for decades. It feels like taking off shoes that were too small and finally letting your feet touch the ground. There is a softness that returns, a quiet spaciousness that had always been there but was hidden beneath layers of effort. From this place, life becomes less about managing yourself and more about listening to yourself. Decisions arise more naturally. Actions feel less forced. You move not because you should, but because something inside gently guides you. And this guidance is much wiser than the anxious mind that was trying to control everything. So letting go is not giving up on growth. It is trusting growth. It is understanding that a flower does not force itself to bloom, and a river does not force itself to flow. And perhaps you, too, do not need to force yourself to become whole. Perhaps you already are whole, and all that is needed is to stop fighting the very life that is trying to carry you forward. And when you finally rest into that truth, when you stop fixing and start allowing, you may feel something very quiet and very beautiful spreading through your chest, like warm light at dawn. The simple relief of realizing that you never had to struggle so hard to be worthy of your own love. 7. Self-acceptance as a quantum doorway. There comes a season in life when you grow tired of trying to improve yourself into existence, tired of rearranging your personality like furniture in a small room, tired of believing that if you could only think better, behave better, meditate better, or heal faster, then life would finally open its doors to you. And in that quiet fatigue, you begin to sense something unexpected, something almost embarrassing in its simplicity, which is the possibility that nothing is fundamentally wrong with you, and that perhaps the door you have been searching for has always been hidden inside the very place you have been trying to escape. For many years, I believed acceptance meant settling, meant lowering standards, meant becoming passive in a world that rewards ambition and effort. And because of that misunderstanding, I resisted acceptance with all my strength, thinking that if I ever truly accepted myself, I would stop growing and become stuck. Yet what I later discovered through experience rather than theory is that self-rejection is what truly keeps a person stuck, while acceptance is what finally allows movement to happen naturally, like a locked joint, suddenly relaxing and remembering how to bend again. When you constantly criticize yourself, you divide your inner world into opposing forces, one part acting as judge and another part acting as the accused. And this inner conflict consumes enormous energy, more energy than you realize, because instead of living your life, you are busy conducting a silent trial inside your own mind, replaying mistakes, rehearsing future fears, and measuring yourself against impossible ideals that no human body or heart was ever meant to satisfy. This constant self-opposition creates noise, and where there is noise, there can be no clarity. Where there is conflict, there can be no harmony. But acceptance does something very different, something almost scientific in its precision, because when you stop fighting yourself, the scattered pieces of your attention begin to gather, and the mind and the heart, which were pulling in opposite directions for so long, slowly begin to face the same way. In the language of physics, there is a word for this alignment: coherence. It is the state in which waves move together rather than against each other, reinforcing instead of canceling, creating strength instead of interference. And although this term belongs to science, you can feel it directly in your body, because coherence is not abstract. It is deeply human. It feels like breathing without tightness. It feels like speaking without pretending. It feels like walking into a room without shrinking or performing. It feels like being at home inside your own skin. When the mind stops attacking the heart, and the heart stops defending itself from the mind, something settles. Your thoughts become less frantic. Your emotions become less dramatic. Your actions become less forced. And from this quiet alignment, reality itself begins to look different. Not because the outer world has magically changed overnight, but because the lens through which you experience it is no longer distorted by inner resistance. For a long time, we are taught that we must push life forward, that we must struggle to make things happen, that if we do not constantly strive, we will be left behind. And so we learn to live like swimmers fighting against a current, exhausting ourselves with every stroke, wondering why progress feels so slow and painful. But when acceptance arises, something unexpected happens. You stop pushing, and when you stop pushing, you realize there was a current all along. Life was already moving. You were the one exhausting yourself by swimming against it. I remember a moment many years ago when everything in my life felt uncertain, when plans had collapsed and the future looked foggy and I had no clear strategy to fix it. And after months of mental struggle, I finally reached a point where I simply said to myself, not with drama but with quiet honesty, I do not know what I am doing, and for now that is okay. And that small sentence, spoken gently rather than angrily, felt like opening a window in a stuffy room. Nothing outside changed immediately. The bills were still there. The questions were still there. But something inside stopped resisting reality. And the moment that resistance fell away, my body relaxed, my breath deepened, and new ideas began to appear naturally. Not forced, not hunted down, but arising on their own like seeds that had been waiting for the soil to soften. This is the strange paradox of acceptance, which is that when you stop trying to control every outcome, life begins to support you in ways you could never have engineered with the mind alone. It is as if existence has been waiting for your permission to help you, as if the universe says quietly, I cannot carry you while you are busy fighting me. When the mind and heart move together, there is less friction. When there is less friction, energy flows more freely. And when energy flows freely, circumstances begin to rearrange in subtle but undeniable ways. You meet the right person at the right time. You say the right words without rehearsing. You feel guided without needing a map, not because you have become special, but because you have stopped blocking what was already available. There is a simple image I often return to, one that has comforted me more than any complicated philosophy, which is the image of water flowing through your hands. If you clench your fists and try to hold the water tightly, it slips away and you are left tense and empty. But if you open your palms and relax your fingers, the water naturally rests there for a moment, cool and gentle, without effort. Life is like that water. The tighter you grip, the faster it escapes. The more you relax, the more it stays. Acceptance is the open hand. Control is the clenched fist. And we have spent so many years clenching that we have forgotten how simple it feels to open. When you accept yourself completely, including the parts you once labeled as broken or unworthy, you create an inner environment of safety. And in that safety, your nervous system calms, your thoughts slow down, and your perception becomes clearer. And from this clarity, choices become wiser, without you having to force wisdom. You begin to trust your own timing. You begin to respect your own pace. You begin to understand that you are not late, not behind, not defective, but simply unfolding in your own rhythm. This state of allowing is where what people call miracles quietly occur, not as supernatural events, but as natural consequences of alignment. Healing happens faster because you are no longer fighting yourself. Relationships soften because you are no longer demanding others complete you. Opportunities appear because you are no longer blinded by fear. Everything feels less like a battle and more like a dance. And perhaps the deepest realization of all is this, that acceptance is not something you achieve one day and keep forever, but something you return to again and again. Like coming home after wandering too far, a gentle remembering that you are already enough, already worthy, already whole. So when you feel lost or inadequate or uncertain, you do not need to repair yourself like a broken machine. You simply pause, you breathe, you place a hand over your heart, and you whisper inwardly, with the kindness you would offer a dear friend, you are allowed to be exactly as you are right now. It is a prize. And in that moment, without fireworks or drama, a quiet doorway opens inside you. A doorway, not to another world, but to a deeper experience of this one, where life no longer feels like something you must conquer, but something that gently carries you forward, step by step, as long as you are willing to soften your grip and let yourself be held. 8. From I must change to I allow. There is a quiet moment that comes to almost every sincere seeker. A moment that rarely appears dramatic on the outside, yet feels like an earthquake within, when you suddenly realize that most of your life has been driven not by love but by pressure, not by inspiration but by a constant whisper inside your head that keeps repeating that you must improve, you must heal, you must become better, you must hurry before time runs out. And although this voice once sounded responsible and mature, you begin to notice how heavy it feels in the body, how it tightens your chest, shortens your breath, and turns even the most beautiful practices into another form of labor. For many years, I lived under the rule of those two words, I must, and they followed me everywhere, like invisible chains, because I must be more successful, I must be more spiritual, I must meditate longer, I must forgive faster, I must release the past immediately. And even my healing became a battlefield where I judged myself for not healing quickly enough, which is perhaps the most painful paradox of all, that we try to force ourselves into peace using the same violence that created our suffering in the first place. Language may seem small and harmless, just sounds passing through the air or thoughts passing through the mind. Yet language is vibration, and vibration shapes perception, and perception quietly builds reality. So the sentences you repeat inside yourself every day are not merely descriptions of life, but instructions that your nervous system and your energy field follow with remarkable obedience. When you say to yourself, I must change, the body hears danger. When the body hears danger, it contracts. When it contracts, creativity disappears. And when creativity disappears, life begins to feel narrow and mechanical. You may not notice this immediately, but over time, the spirit becomes tired, like a child who has been scolded too often and no longer wants to play. I must carries the energy of pressure, and pressure always implies that something is wrong right now and must be fixed before you are allowed to rest, before you are allowed to be worthy, before you are allowed to belong. It is a subtle form of self-rejection disguised as self-improvement. It is the voice of the inner critic wearing the mask of discipline. And although discipline has its place in practical matters, it cannot guide the heart, because the heart does not open through force. The heart opens through safety. The heart opens through kindness. The heart opens through permission. There was a season in my life when I noticed that every morning I woke up already feeling behind, already feeling as if I had failed some invisible test before the day even began. And my mind would immediately list all the things I had to correct about myself, from my habits to my emotions to my past mistakes. And even though I called this self-work, it felt more like self-punishment, because no matter how much I accomplished, the voice of not enough simply moved the finish line farther away. One day, out of exhaustion rather than wisdom, I stopped trying to fix anything, not because I had solved my problems, but because I simply had no energy left to fight myself. I sat quietly, looked at the mess of my thoughts and feelings, and instead of saying, I must change this, I heard myself say something softer, something almost unfamiliar, which was maybe I can just allow this to be here for now. Everyone. That small shift did not look impressive from the outside, yet it changed everything inside. Because the moment I said, allow, my body relaxed, my shoulders dropped, my breath deepened, the war paused, and in that pause, I felt a kind of space I had not felt in years. Allowing is gentle, yet it is not weak. Allowing is soft, yet it is not passive. Allowing is trust in motion. When you say, I allow, you are not giving up on growth. You are simply stepping out of conflict with the present moment. And paradoxically, growth begins to happen faster because you are no longer wasting energy resisting what already is. In a way that feels almost quantum, your inner state reorganizes. Your thoughts become less chaotic. Your emotions move more freely instead of getting stuck. It is as if the different parts of you, which were previously arguing, finally sit at the same table and listen to one another. And from this inner coherence, new possibilities appear naturally, not because you forced them into existence, but because you stopped blocking them with tension. Think of creativity like a shy animal in the forest. If you chase it loudly, it runs away. If you sit quietly and become still, it slowly approaches on its own. Life responds the same way. When you demand and control, it retreats. When you soften and allow, it comes closer. This is why people often notice their best ideas arriving in the shower, on a walk, or just before sleep, when they are not trying so hard. Because in those moments, they are allowing. They are not pushing. They are not shouting instructions at reality. They are simply open. And openness is the doorway through which inspiration enters. I must is the language of fear. I allow is the language of trust. Fear contracts the field of possibilities. Trust expands it. Fear says life is against me. Trust says life is working with me, even when I cannot yet see how. When you live from I must, every step feels heavy, like walking uphill with a backpack full of stones. When you live from I allow, the same path feels lighter, as if the ground itself is gently supporting your feet. Nothing magical has changed outside, yet everything feels different because your relationship with the moment has softened. And life, strangely enough, responds much faster to softness than to force. A seed does not grow because you yell at it. A wound does not heal because you command it. A child does not blossom because you pressure them constantly. Growth happens in safety, in warmth, in permission. You are no different. So perhaps the most compassionate practice is also the simplest, which is to listen carefully to the sentences you repeat inside yourself each day. And when you catch the old voice saying, I must be better, I must hurry, I must fix myself, you gently replace it with something kinder. Something like, I allow myself to learn, I allow myself to feel, I allow life to unfold through me. This is not laziness. This is alignment. This is not avoidance. This is wisdom, born from experience. Because after walking through enough darkness, you realize that forcing yourself never led to freedom, and that the door you were pushing so hard was never locked in the first place. It only needed you to stop pushing and simply open it. And when you finally do, when you choose allowing over forcing, something subtle yet profound happens, as if the whole universe exhales with you, as if life has been waiting patiently for you to relax your grip. And from that relaxation, a new way of living begins to emerge, quieter, gentler, more natural, where you are no longer trying to become someone else, but simply allowing yourself to be fully, honestly, beautifully human. 9. Everyday practices for living in a state of enoughness. There comes a point on this inner journey where all the big words begin to lose their shine, where the philosophies, the teachings, the complex explanations about consciousness and energy fields quietly step aside, and what remains is something disarmingly simple, almost ordinary, because after everything you have read and everything you have tried, you begin to realize that awakening is not hidden in some distant mountain or secret ritual, but woven gently into the small movements of daily life, into the way you breathe in the morning light, into the way you place your feet on the floor, into the way you speak to yourself when no one else is listening. For a long time, I believed transformation had to be dramatic and impressive, that it required radical breakthroughs or mystical experiences. Yet what truly changed me were not the fireworks, but the quiet minutes when I chose to sit still instead of running away from myself, when I chose to listen instead of fixing, when I chose to treat my own heart like I would treat an old friend who had been tired for many years. Living in a state of enoughness is not something you achieve once and keep forever like a trophy on a shelf, but something you gently return to again and again through small, faithful practices that may look insignificant to the world, yet feel sacred to the soul, because they slowly retrain your nervous system to feel safe inside your own existence. Each morning, before the noise of the day begins to claim you, before the phone lights up with demands and the mind starts listing responsibilities, you can simply sit down and do nothing for a few quiet minutes, while observing your breath as it moves in and out, like the tide of a calm ocean. And although this sounds almost too simple to matter, those few minutes are like opening a window in a closed room, allowing fresh air to enter spaces that have been stale for years. When you sit and watch the breath without trying to control it, you are sending a message to your whole being that nothing is wrong right now and nothing needs to be fixed in this moment. And that message, repeated day after day, begins to soften the old habit of urgency that has kept you in survival mode for so long. The breath becomes an anchor, a quiet reminder that life is already happening without your effort, that your heart is beating without commands, that existence is supporting you, even when you stop trying so hard. And slowly you start to trust that perhaps you are carried more than you are carrying. Later in the morning, with a cup of coffee or tea resting warmly in your hands, you might take a small notebook and write down a few things you feel grateful for. Not because gratitude is another task on a spiritual checklist, but because gratitude gently shifts your attention from what is missing to what is already here. And attention is one of the most creative forces in the universe. What you consistently notice begins to grow in your experience. If you constantly notice lack, lack expands. If you quietly notice simple blessings, such as the softness of sunlight on the wall, or the sound of a familiar voice, or the miracle that your body has carried you through another night, then a subtle sense of abundance begins to take root inside you, like a seed finding good soil. Gratitude does not deny pain or difficulty, but it balances the lens through which you see life, reminding you that even in imperfect days, there are still small gifts waiting to be recognized. And over time, this gentle recognition changes your baseline emotional state, because you begin to feel supported rather than deprived, accompanied rather than alone. Throughout the day, you may also begin to practice something that many people have forgotten how to do, which is listening to your body as carefully as you listen to your thoughts, because the body speaks in sensations long before the mind turns them into stories. And if you learn to notice those sensations with kindness, you can respond to yourself with much more wisdom. Perhaps you feel tightness in your shoulders and realize you have been pushing too hard. Perhaps you feel heaviness in your stomach and recognize unspoken worry. Instead of judging these signals, you simply pause, breathe, stretch, drink water, or step outside for fresh air, treating the body not like a machine to be forced, but like a companion to be cared for. This small act of listening slowly rebuilds trust between you and yourself. You stop abandoning your own needs. You stop overriding your own limits. And in that respect, a quiet dignity returns. Sometimes the most healing practice of all is to walk slowly in nature without any goal, without turning it into exercise or productivity. Just walking as if the earth itself were holding you, feeling the ground under your feet, noticing the movement of trees in the wind, hearing birds or distant sounds, and allowing your nervous system to remember something ancient and simple, which is that you belong here. In those moments, the mind naturally becomes quieter. The endless self-improvement project loses its grip. You realize that the trees are not trying to become better trees, and the sky is not trying to become a better sky, and yet everything seems perfectly itself. Nature teaches you without words that existence does not struggle to justify itself. It simply is. And perhaps you are allowed to simply be as well. These ordinary walks often feel like reconnecting to a larger field of energy that has always supported you, as if your personal worries dissolve into something wider and more spacious, and you remember that you are not an isolated fragment fighting alone, but a small expression of a vast intelligence moving through all things. And then there is one more practice, so simple that the mind may dismiss it, yet so powerful that it can quietly reshape your entire life, which is to gently repeat to yourself, especially in difficult moments, that nothing is fundamentally wrong with you. Not as an affirmation you force yourself to believe, but as a soft reminder, like a hand resting on your heart. Nothing is wrong with me. Nothing is broken. Nothing needs to be fixed before I am worthy of love. At first, this sentence may feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because you have been trained for so long to look for flaws. Yet if you repeat it with sincerity, something inside begins to relax, like a child finally hearing the words they have waited their whole life to hear. And from that relaxation, a different kind of strength appears. Not the strength of struggle, but the strength of peace. These small daily rituals may never impress anyone else, and they may never look dramatic enough to share on a stage. Yet they slowly reshape your inner world in ways that grand efforts never could, because they are rooted in kindness rather than pressure, in allowing rather than forcing. And in that gentleness, you finally discover what you have been searching for all along, which is the quiet, steady feeling that you are already enough, exactly as you are, in this ordinary, sacred moment. 10. The moment you realize you were never broken. There is a quiet kind of clarity that does not arrive with thunder or fireworks. A clarity that slips into your life like early morning light through a half-open curtain, gentle and almost unnoticed at first. Yet once it is here, you cannot deny it, because something inside you finally softens in a way it never has before. And you begin to understand, not as an idea, but as a lived truth in your bones, that the long journey you thought was about fixing yourself was never about repair at all, but about remembering. When I look back on my own path now, I do not see a straight line or a perfect story. I see confusion and detours, and seasons of doubt, where I questioned everything. I see mistakes that once kept me awake at night, and choices I would have sworn had ruined my life. Yet strangely, when I stand here today with a quieter heart and a steadier breath, I can see that every single step, even the ones I called failures, was guiding me to this exact place of understanding. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was accidental. Nothing was truly wrong. At the time, it never felt that way. Because when you are inside the storm, you only feel the rain and the wind and the cold. And you cannot imagine that the storm itself is clearing the air for something new. Yet later, when the sky opens and the clouds drift away, you realize that the storm was not punishment but preparation. The relationships that ended, the plans that collapsed, the nights you cried alone wondering why life seemed so heavy, all of it shaped you in quiet and invisible ways, softening your pride, deepening your compassion, cracking open the hard shell of the ego so that something more honest could finally breathe. For many years, I carried the secret belief that there must be something fundamentally wrong with me, something flawed at the core, because no matter how much I achieved or how much I learned, there was always a subtle sense of not being enough, as if I were a house built slightly crooked that needed constant renovation. And this belief drove almost everything I did, from the books I read to the meditations I practiced, to the way I spoke to myself in the mirror. And yet the more I tried to repair this imaginary flaw, the more exhausted I became, because you cannot fix something that was never broken in the first place. It is like polishing a window that is already clear, or searching the entire house for your glasses while they are resting quietly on your face. The effort itself creates the frustration. The searching itself hides what is already here. There came a moment, not dramatic but deeply intimate, when I simply stopped arguing with my past. I stopped trying to rewrite my story. I stopped labeling certain chapters as mistakes. Instead, I sat quietly and allowed my memories to rise without judgment, like old photographs spread across a table, and for the first time, I looked at them with kindness rather than shame. And something unexpected happened. I began to see that what I had called mistakes were actually teachers in disguise. The job I lost taught me humility and courage. The heartbreak that shattered me taught me how deeply I could love. The loneliness I feared taught me how to befriend myself. Every fall carved out more space inside my heart. Every disappointment stripped away another illusion about who I thought I had to be. If those events had not happened, I might still be chasing approval, still trying to perform a version of myself that was never true. So what I once called failure was actually awakening in slow motion. What I once called brokenness was actually transformation. Life was not attacking me. Life was guiding me. And when this realization finally settled into me, it felt less like discovering something new and more like remembering something ancient, something I had always known as a child before the world told me otherwise. It felt like coming home after a very long trip, not the kind of home with walls and furniture, but the feeling of home inside your own chest, the feeling of resting in yourself without the need to pretend or improve or explain. A deep exhale moved through me, the kind you do not even know you have been holding for years. My shoulders relaxed, my mind grew quiet, and there was this simple, undeniable truth whispering through everything, which was that I had never been broken. Not once, not ever. There was nothing to repair, nothing to upgrade, nothing to earn. There was only forgetting and remembering. Forgetting who I truly was beneath the conditioning. Remembering the quiet presence that had always been here. Watching, breathing, aware. This presence had never been damaged by my mistakes. It had never been stained by my past. It had simply been waiting patiently for me to stop fighting myself long enough to notice it. When you touch this place inside, even briefly, something changes forever. Because you stop relating to yourself as a problem to solve and begin relating to yourself as a life to experience. And that shift is so gentle yet so profound that it rearranges everything. The way a small adjustment of the lens can suddenly bring the entire landscape into focus. You begin to treat yourself with more tenderness. You forgive faster. You laugh more easily. You stop demanding perfection from each day. You allow yourself to be human, beautifully imperfect and yet mysteriously whole. And from that wholeness, your actions become lighter and more natural, not driven by fear but guided by quiet intuition. It is a strange paradox, but the moment you stop trying to fix yourself is the moment real change begins to happen. Because now, your growth is no longer an escape from self-hatred, but an expression of self-love. You do not improve because you are lacking. You evolve because you are alive. Just as a tree grows taller, not because it is inadequate, but because growth is its nature. So when you look back on your own life, perhaps with tears in your eyes and a softer heart, you may begin to see what I have come to see, which is that everything, absolutely everything, has been leading you here, to this quiet recognition that you were never meant to become someone else. You were only meant to remember who you have always been. And when that recognition finally lands, it feels like setting down a heavy suitcase you did not realize you were carrying. It feels like walking into a familiar room after years away. It feels like the simplest and most honest relief, like coming home after a very long journey, like resting at last in the truth that nothing was ever wrong with you, and nothing ever needed to be. The gentle whisper of returning. There is a certain kind of tiredness that does not come from the body but from the soul. A tiredness that accumulates quietly over the years, from trying too hard to be worthy, from carrying expectations that were never truly yours, from waking up each day with the unconscious belief that you must improve yourself before you are allowed to rest. And if you listen closely, you may notice that this tiredness is not asking for another technique or another lesson, but simply asking you to stop, not to stop living, not to stop caring, but to stop struggling against yourself, because perhaps the most sacred thing you can do today is not to add anything new to your life. Not another book, not another practice, not another promise to become better tomorrow, but to gently set everything down for a moment and allow yourself to be exactly as you are. For many years, we have been taught that effort is the only path to progress, that pushing harder is always noble, that if something does not work, we must simply try more intensely. And this mentality may help us build careers and solve practical problems. Yet, when we apply the same force to the heart, something inside begins to fracture, because the heart does not respond to pressure the way machines do. The heart responds to safety. The heart responds to kindness. The heart responds to being welcomed home. Imagine for a moment that you have been walking for a very long time, carrying a heavy backpack filled with stones you picked up along the way. Stones labeled regret, guilt, comparison, self-judgment, and the endless need to prove yourself, and you have carried this weight for so long that you almost forgot it was there, because it simply became normal. Then one day you stop walking. You slowly take the backpack off your shoulders. You place it gently on the ground, and for the first time in years, you feel how light your body actually is. That is what it feels like to stop trying to fix yourself. Nothing dramatic has changed outside. The road is still the same. The sky is still the same. But you are no longer carrying unnecessary weight. And suddenly the journey feels softer, almost peaceful. So much of our suffering does not come from life itself, but from the story that we must constantly repair who we are before we deserve to exist comfortably in our own skin. We tell ourselves that once we heal everything, once we become calmer, wiser, more spiritual, then we will finally allow ourselves to relax. But that day never arrives, because the mind will always invent another flaw to correct. It is an endless project with no finish line, and somewhere deep down, the soul grows weary of this endless construction site. There is a quiet wisdom that begins to emerge after enough disappointment, after enough chasing, after enough nights staring at the ceiling, wondering why nothing feels complete. And that wisdom whispers something very simple and very honest, which is that maybe you were never meant to be a project at all. Maybe you were meant to be a presence. Maybe you were meant to be experienced, not improved. When you stop trying to repair yourself, something unexpected happens. The heart, which has been clenched for so long, slowly begins to open. Not because you forced it, not because you figured everything out, but because there is finally no pressure squeezing it shut, and an open heart is like an open window. Light does not need to be invited. It simply enters. Love does not need to be chased. It simply flows. Clarity does not need to be manufactured. It naturally appears. This is the strange and beautiful paradox that took me many years to understand, which is that the more you try to control your inner world, the darker it feels, and the more you soften your grip, the more light seems to find you on its own, as if life has been patiently waiting for you to step aside so it can move through you freely. You begin to notice small changes. You breathe a little deeper. You speak to yourself more gently. You forgive your past more easily. You stop replaying old mistakes like broken records. And instead of asking every morning what needs to be fixed today, you quietly ask how you can simply be present today. This presence is not passive. It is alive. It is aware. It is quietly powerful. From this place, actions still happen. Responsibilities are still handled. Life continues as always. Yet everything feels different because your actions are no longer fueled by fear of not being enough, but by a natural desire to express what is already whole inside you. It feels less like pushing a heavy cart uphill and more like floating with the current of a gentle river. And perhaps this is what returning truly means. Not traveling somewhere else, not becoming someone new, but coming back to the simplest truth that has always been here. The truth that before the world told you who to be, before you learned to criticize yourself, before you carried all those stones, you were already complete. You were already worthy. You were already enough. So tonight, when the day grows quiet and the lights begin to dim, and you find yourself alone with your thoughts the way you have been so many nights before, you do not need to analyze or plan or improve anything. You do not need to solve your life before you sleep. You can simply lie down, place a gentle hand over your heart, and speak to yourself the way you would speak to someone you love deeply. And in that quiet darkness, you might whisper softly, almost like a secret meant only for you, that you are already enough, that nothing is missing, that nothing is broken, and then just watch, patiently and tenderly, as something inside you loosens, as if an old knot has finally untied itself. Because sometimes the greatest miracle is not something you achieve. Sometimes the greatest miracle is simply what happens when you finally stop trying and allow yourself to come home.